Welcome back to Live from Paris. It's time for business now. Owen is back with us. Hello again, Owen. And we're starting off with a look at the Japanese market. It's a very good end of the month for them.
Yeah, a bit of a quiet day in itself, Claire. The Nikkei just finishing the day around 0.1% up. But overall, this has been the best month on the Nikkei. You'd have to go back to 1999 to find as good a performance. In fact, the Nikkei over the course of January is up some 4%, and that is not something you say very often these days about trading in Japan. You can see that the similar kind of picture reflected across the markets, just the Shanghai Composite turning negative in the afternoon session, but altogether a good day for the Nikkei, a good month for the Nikkei. Lots of analysts saying that many stocks in Japan are undervalued right now after a pretty miserable past 12 months or so.
Now, we looked earlier at the new budget rules that EU leaders agreed on in Brussels yesterday, but you think that what the Greeks had to say afterwards is significant?
Yeah, there's definitely a growing sense of exasperation among many of these EU leaders about the Greeks. They're unhappy with the fact that the Greeks are failing to meet their austerity targets, failing simply to cut back enough and bring those debts down. And yet that was all compounded by a fairly stunning admission for me from the Greek Prime Minister that Greece might need even more public funding. Take that to mean emergency funding on top of not one, but of course a second bailout now is on the cards as well. This as well after the Greece rejected the idea that anybody outside Greece should be having any kind of control over its budgets. Kyle Brown has more details for us.
After a first bailout loan of 110 billion euros, Greece hopes to secure another worth 130 billion. But the Prime Minister left open the possibility that the debt-ridden country could need yet more assistance.
Again, it's too early right now to say whether we will need some extra public funding. Our goal is to avert such an alternative. That's our goal. Our goal is to avert further funding support by our creditors.
And for a second bailout, a number of conditions must be fulfilled, including an arrangement in which private sector bondholders write off up to 70% on the nearly 200 billion euros of Greek bonds. Some analysts say for Greece to restructure its debt, it must make deeper spending cuts and introduce more labour market reforms.
They are not delivering on their own promises when it comes to reforms. And of course, you can see an increase in frustration over that.
Greece is due to pay 14.5 billion euros in bond repayments in late March, which it cannot afford to pay without assistance. European negotiations with Greece overshadowed the Brussels summit, where EU leaders agreed to accelerate the setup of a general 500 billion euro rescue fund. They also signed off on a German-inspired deficit control treaty.
So the financial future of Greece remains far from certain. Plenty more on the menu in Brussels yesterday. You're not convinced about the new budget rules?
Well, no, once again, Claire, we're seeing them watering down essentially key components of this fiscal compact, this whole budget harmonisation deal that's supposed to really stop any repetition of this whole sovereign debt crisis. And yet you can see them setting themselves up potentially for another fall. If you take, for example, the whole fiscal compact, that's not letting individual countries let their budget deficits go beyond 3% of GDP. Well, OK, there is that limit in place, but they've also nuanced the wording of this a little bit to give countries a little bit of wriggle room, putting a sort of lower limit rather than an upper limit down. And it just muddies the picture a little bit. Remember, it was this whole busting of deficits which got these countries like Greece into this whole debt crisis in the first place. And let's not forget, both Germany and France also let their budget deficits run away as well. And so Greece weren't the only ones. There's also a lack of clarity really about who and when who should punish these budget offenders, really. Yes, it's likely to be the European Court of Justice. Nobody's really sure, though, at what point the European Court of Justice would come in and how exactly it would punish these countries. Perhaps the one bit of clarity we did get is exactly where these fines will be paid should these countries breach these deficit rules. Now, they've agreed that Eurozone countries that breach the rules, well, their fines will be paid into a Eurozone fund, i.e. this second bailout fund. Those outside the Eurozone, i.e. Denmark and the UK, well, their fines, should they breach the deficits, would go into a more general EU budget. They consider that a fairer way of dealing with it all.
So that last point is good for your non-Eurozone countries like Denmark and the UK. Speaking of the UK, it wouldn't be an EU summit if, dare I say it, without a little bit of Anglo-Franco tension.
Absolutely, yeah. After that big spat between President Sarkozy and the UK Prime Minister David Cameron before Christmas over the UK signing up to this fiscal compact, this was the first time these two men were face-to-face at this kind of summit. And it has to be said, David Cameron had a pretty good summit. Remember, this summit in Brussels was just hours after President Sarkozy said that France would unilaterally impose a financial transaction tax on shares dealt both in France and for anyone wanting to trade shares outside of France. This gave David Cameron a very good opportunity to extol the virtues of the City of London, because remember, the UK and the US together have said they will never sign up to this kind of tax on financial transactions. David Cameron particularly thinks this kind of tax will hamper free trade. He went on to suggest that French banks might like to relocate to London. I don't think President Sarkozy would like that very much. But he also used the opportunity to remind EU leaders why he thinks the City of London is such a valuable place to do business.
It is a widespread industry and one of Britain's strengths. And that's why I've been so clear about the financial transactions tax. If other countries want to put in place a financial transactions tax as originally envisaged by the European Commission, I know I use the word mad, but I do think it's an extraordinary thing to do. The European Commission has told us this would cost Europe 500,000 jobs.
Let's get a bit more of the day's news now. Amazon is expected to report a sharp drop in earnings despite surging sales later this Tuesday. The online retailer's Fire Kindle tablet computer has helped sales reach an estimated $18.3 billion over the Christmas period, a 40% increase on the previous year. But thin profit margins mean earnings are expected to be around 17 cents per share, down from 91 cents for the same period a year earlier.
BlackBerry manufacturer RAM should never again combine the roles of chief executive and chairman as it did under its founders. That's the conclusion of an independent review into its leadership. The two positions were shared by Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie before they bowed to investor demands to stand down as RAM loses market share to Apple. The Canadian firm, which has lost more than 70% of its market value over the past year, has recovered 8% since the resignations of Balsillie and Lazaridis last week, but they remain on the board.
And the French and Italian governments have signed a deal to create a new high-speed railway from Lyon to Turin. The €20 million project will involve digging a 57-kilometre-long tunnel through the Alps. When the line is completed in 2023, it will halve the journey time between Paris and Milan and Lyon and Turin. Next, a series of profit warnings, a struggle to find its feet in emerging markets. French supermarket giant Carrefour has been humbled in the past few years, so it's counting on a change at the top. Its current CEO stood down on Monday, announcing he wouldn't seek another term. He's been replaced by a veteran of French retailing. Karen Creed has more.
He had declined the offer before, but now Georges Plaza has accepted the top job at Carrefour. The 62-year-old CEO of Vivart will start in June, and already analysts are welcoming his arrival. He will replace Lars Olofsson, but the task is not one for the light-hearted, as Carrefour is in serious crisis. Shares have lost over 40% in 2011 alone, and profitability of the company should fall by 20%. Georges Plaza is taking on a group that has tried other operating strategies without success. Carrefour Planet, for example, a new hypermarket concept dedicated to items other than food. Too expensive, some say. Unrealistic, according to others. The results are not impressive. But the Carrefour Group has not lost its appeal in the company's principal market, France. It does, however, face stiff competition from independent groups who've lowered their prices. Their woes abroad are also escalating. In Brazil, they've been battling their reputation following an accounting fraud scandal, while in China, the group is facing difficulties securing itself in the market. Perhaps the only saving grace for the failing Carrefour is that the arrival of Georges Plaza is already appearing to boost the brand, but the pressure will be on to see if he can turn around their fortunes.
That's it for business. Thanks very much, Owen. And you're now up to date. All the latest headlines are coming up in just a couple of minutes with Stuart. Don't go away.